Hello, everybody. My name is Mike O'Connell with the Larimer Small Business Development Center. We are here for this panel today that is being put on by the Turnaround Management Association and the Colorado Small Business Development Center. This is called Entrepreneurial Preservation and Having the Tough Conversation. We're going to cover some topics that are involved with turnarounds that the business person, the entrepreneur normally may not run into. And we have some specialists here who have been through the situation that are going to lend some, I think, pretty insightful and pretty helpful background as well as tactics to help the entrepreneur go through this process. So it's about 2 o'clock. And I think what we're going to do first is we will have each panelist introduce themselves. I'll begin with me and then we'll move on to our other panelists. My name is Mike O'Connell. I run the Larimer Small Business Development Center in Northern Colorado. The SBDC does Street Smart Business Consulting nationwide. There's about 1,000 centers around the country and about 15 centers here in the state of Colorado. I'm a former small business owner. I owned a furniture manufacturing company for about 11 years and a retail store. And I was also in corporate sales, marketing, business unit management positions for a couple of commercial industrial companies. And I've been with the SBDC for about 8 years, working with entrepreneurs. It's a great job. And I enjoy working with local entrepreneurs in Northern Colorado very much. And from there, I will go to Mr. Dave Johnson, who is with the Turnaround Management Association and is one of the founders and a principal at C Squared Solutions. So Dave, to you.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon to those of you online. Dave Johnson, Managing Partner, C Squared Solutions. We are a consulting company that provides fractional interim CFOs, COOs, and CEOs to medium-sized businesses across the country. We actually become part of the management team and help with growing the company and in some cases turning around the company. We are industry agnostic and just about everything except for banking and aerospace defense. All of our people on our team have started a company, run a company, and sold a company. So we've sat in the chair and understand what it's like to sweat through payrolls. So.
Thank you, Dave. From there, I will go to Mr. David Silverman, who is the president of the Turnaround Management Association, Rocky Mountain Chapter, and is the founder and owner of the Silverman Law Firm in Denver. David?
Thanks, Mike. Like David, I am a business owner. I've owned my own law firm since 1983. Been through all the ups and downs, sat in the chair, know what it's like, got to make that payroll, got to pivot, got to face all the crises when they come, when they go, good times and the bad times. I'm currently the president of the Turnaround Management Association, a wonderful organization that has a tremendous amount of resources for small and mid-market businesses. And our primary goal here today is to provide you with some insight into how to work through some crises and to make sure that you know that we are all out there for you, not just ODIT and SBDC, but also with the Turnaround Management Association, such as Mr. Johnson, Dave Johnson, and Andrew Wilhelmy, who you'll meet in a moment. And remember, you are not alone out there. We've all been through this. You've got plenty of help. And we're here to help you.
Thank you, David. I'm next going to ask Glenn Plagans to introduce himself. He is a former small business owner. He is the Director of Business Support and Rural Prosperity in the Office of Economic Development. And he's also the gentleman who hired me for this job about 8 years ago. So Mr. Glenn Plagans, I will turn it over to you. And he has the management of the Colorado SBDC as one of his responsibilities.
Yeah, I oversee the Colorado Small Business Development Center network now, the Minority Business Office, Rural Opportunity Office, and our Employee Ownership Office. And today's a talk that's near and dear to my heart after 23 years of small business ownership myself in the towing products industry. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but again, I'm going to echo what David said is a lot of experience on this panel today, talking about some things that, are basically what we look at as entrepreneurial techniques. We look at, how do we take an entrepreneur during these tough, difficult times and take what our experience is and get you to the point where, we're past this initial crisis and we're past this right now, so that you can do what you need to do with your business and get back to selling things and everything else, just like you were before it all started. So thanks for having me aboard.
Thank you, Glenn. Before I move on and introduce our facilitator, I do want to introduce Becky Doffett, who is our SBDC marketing guru and administrator, and she's also going to be a wing person on the chat discussion and helping field questions and make sure everything gets addressed here. So myself, Glenn, Dave, David, we are going to be your four panelists. I'm now going to introduce Andrew Wilhelmy, who is the chairperson of the Rocky Mountain chapter of the Turnaround Management Association, and he is also the principal at Alphi Capital LLC, and he's going to bring some great perspective on alternate financing. So Andrew, would you please introduce yourself and then just run with the ball, because you are going to step in your facilitator role from there. So
great. Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. Andrew Wilhelmy, president of Alphi Capital. I've been in commercial finance for roughly, I hate to say it, almost 25 years now in one form or another. So kind of been there and done it all and seen it all, I think, until we had a pandemic. So just when you think you've seen it all, here comes something new. But anyway, happy to be your moderator today and share some experiences. And, I'll come at this from a couple perspectives. One, as a turnaround practitioner, and two, as an alternative non-bank lender, and three, as a former commercial banker. So having been around the ecosystem, hopefully I can provide some insight along with our other great panelists about how to approach difficult situations and in what has become a very difficult environment for a lot of owners and entrepreneurs. So without further ado, I'm going to start this off by asking questions of our panelists. And my first question, I think, is going to be really interesting for everyone to hear and very helpful, because our panelist, Glenn, has actually been on this journey as an entrepreneur who struggled through the last Great Recession, knows what it's like to have to deal with creditors and banks and everything in between. And I'd like, Glenn, for you to just talk about what that experience was like for you.
Yeah, so the context of my experience was in the 2007, 2008, recession. I was a business owner at that time, and I had to resize my business. I had a big company that I supplied. I was in the towing products business, and that company went bankrupt, and I was left on the short end of the stick. I was left with about 50% more capacity than I needed at the time, both in buildings and assets and employees, you name it. And what that really did is it took me into a position where I had to rescale things and I had to pivot. What ended up happening along the way is I had a piece of property and I decided to go ahead and put it on the open market. And there's anything with the other, with the 2008 recession is, the market for property was not that great. And I was in the Midwest at the time, so we were affected really bad during that time. And one of the things that ended up happening along the way is I was dealing with my lender. I had negotiated an interest-only loan with my lender, taking my note to interest only, and then I triggered a notice of default, and I didn't expect it. And I'll never forget the day and the time I was sitting there, and I was just terrified. I mean, I was just sitting there holding this letter, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I thought I was set. And I thought that I had negotiated with my bank, and I did. And all my due diligence, I had a plan, right? And looking at that, I was just terrified, and I didn't know what it meant, okay? And that's the thing that we really talked about in preparation for this, was the fact that if there's one thing to get out of this today is figuring out in advance what these things mean while you go along. I thought it was the end, but it wasn't. Okay. It was just something that was triggered within the bank. It's a legal thing. David will know more about the inner workings of that process as we go along and unpack that a little bit. But, eventually I sold the property. I still kept working with the bank. I received some loan forgiveness. It was 2008. So some of that was on the table and it worked out. That's what they call it when you're with a lending institution and you go through this. It's called a workout.
Yeah.
And for me, it worked out in that particular case. And I know this is a trying time, just like 2008. This is a little bit different now. Obviously, we have a pandemic. We don't have a real estate crisis, but there were some things that, looking back on that, I wanted to share that were really important at the time. The first thing is working your timeline. And this is all about cash flow. And we talk about cash flow and everything else, but, with this, what we're talking about is we're just talking about, we've got to get to point A to point B when there's no longer a pandemic, and how do we increase that timeline? And it's about managing your cash flow. And this summer, when some of the restrictions started to be released in the state or started to started to change in the state, we saw communities in the mountain towns with 125% of retail sales. So this is a little bit different because in 2008, we didn't really have that. We were in a real estate crash or whatever we want to call it. And now we've got a pandemic, but we got a little bit of a test of all the pent up demand and things of that nature, that will happen hopefully when we get a vaccine. And now we've seen, great news lately about a vaccine. So the first thing is to manage that timeline. And then the second thing is, the resources. When I held that letter and, was just scared to death, one of the first people I called was a really good friend of mine who was also my certified public accountant. He was also a retired or semi-retired, I guess what you would say, vice president at a bank. So he knew exactly what it was. 5-minute conversation with him, talked me down, and I was able to reach out to the bank, make sure everything was okay. And that letter didn't mean as much. So, a terrifying situation. If I had known it was coming, I would have said, oh, hey, here's a default letter. Yeah, that's triggered automatically. Let me just do my check-ins with my bank and my CPA, make sure everything's okay. But in that particular case, using that resource, we have resources here. We have the Turnaround Management Association. We have the Small Business Development Center Network. We have people that can help out with this type of thing as you go through it, that you can talk to and get resources. The third thing I want to mention that's so important is just capital, right? I mean, in 2008, we didn't really have stimulus, okay? But now there's stimulus plans, there's stimulus on the horizon. There's small communities are standing up loan funds, they're standing up grant programs. And that circles right back to that timeline where it extends my timeline, right? And that's really what this is about today, is to say, what are those tools? Where are the resources? Who can I talk to? Because I know what it was like. And I just want people out there to experience and say that, there are resources. What I don't want to have happen is somebody to go at the end of this pandemic and say, we didn't know you existed. So we're going to really broadcast this in a really aggressive manner after we're done today, so people can find those resources and have those conversations going forward.
Thank you, Glenn. That is great advice. And I want to ask a follow-up question. Having gone through that experience and shared all of those things with us today, is there anything looking back that you would do differently if you were headed towards that process? I mean, there might be somebody out there today in our audience who's thinking, oh, I have this month covered, or I have through this year covered, but I don't know at this rate if I'm going to make it through next year. And what would you share about that experience that you would do differently that might resonate with someone today?
So I'm going to answer it this way. What I'm going to do differently in what I did. One of the things that I did is I knew my cash flow to the penny. I knew exactly what my timeline was, and I was able to construct that over the course of the crisis that I went through. And on a daily basis, I knew my cash flow to a penny. And if you're looking at your timeline, that's the kind of intelligence that you need as a business owner to survive this. Because what you're doing is you're looking at changing things within your paradigm. You got a grant fund for $8,000. How does that extend your timeline? You have to negotiate with supplier A or supplier B. How does that negotiate your timeline? You go from 30 days to 60 days on accounts payable. So knowing your timeline and having your resources right there and managing it. If there was one thing I didn't do right away that I really want to, say is, I worked with a lot of people, but I didn't extend my circle long enough, hard or wide enough. Okay. I didn't know my SBDC even existed in 2000, my Small Business Development Center. I had never heard of it. And it was at my local community college that I went to. I went to that community college. So the one thing I didn't do that I would really urge people to do is just talk to other business owners, know where your resources are, talk to the people in your economic development departments, try to figure out what they're working on and what type of programs they have going forward that you might be able to take advantage of. Because if you understand or that a program's coming maybe a month from now, if you live in XYZ community, that again can increase your timeline. So that was the one thing. I kind of had a few people I relied on, but I didn't put that scope out big enough. And I wish I would have, because as I went on as a business owner and as a Small Business Development Center director, now in my current role, I am amazed and blown away by the amount of resources out there and the people that care that will help you with this type of stuff. And that's something that I didn't have. And that's something I encourage people to do.
Yeah, it's great advice, because everybody on this panel today is here to help and available. And certainly, David and I, through our association with the Turnaround Management Association, and Glenn and Mike, through the SBDCs and the Office of Economic Development, there's a lot of resources. We're going to make all of these resources available to everyone who's tuning in today. So you'll have contact info and so on, because we really want this to make an impact in the Front Range and to help to the extent that we can, because it's tough sledding, and everybody on this panel has been through it before. So please reach out when we're finished and access that information. I want to turn to Mike. Mike, what are you seeing? You're up in Fort Collins and obviously doing great work with the SBDC in Larimer County. And I'd like you to share some of the things that you're seeing. What are you hearing from entrepreneurs as they contact you for help? And what does it look like out there right now?
Well, it's I'm going to break that into a couple of different segments. I'm going to break it into business to consumer businesses and business to business. I heard somebody use the expression about a K-shaped recovery, where some people are doing okay and maybe revenues are even up. Think about liquor stores, think of maybe construction companies, and others where it's really trending down, such as a retailer, if you're not Amazon, and restaurants and bars where you've been heavily impacted. So a cleaning company where you can't send your people into clients' houses anymore, or half of them have decided they don't want somebody coming in their house because they've got a susceptible child or older adult. So it's a very, very disjointed, very different recession for different people. And some people aren't even noticing the recession; they're going right past it. So that's what I'm seeing. Is we just had a couple of focus groups here in Northern Colorado. Some were broken out by industry, where we heard people that run events shows talking about they were heavily reliant on weddings, and 90% of the weddings have been postponed. And man, that's a really tough thing to overcome, versus where maybe your revenues might be down 10% or 15%, where you as a business owner have a capability to manage it. I will say a couple of things that we advise clients when they come in, not only existing businesses, but people that are starting something, is, what do you avoid? What do you watch out for? And as part of our class that we call Essential Steps for Starting a Business, Operating Your Business, I've put a list together about 6 things where we're really conscious about knowing what's going on with your business. And number one thing that I want to know is, what is your competitive advantage? And to put that in crassly commercial terms, what are you selling, whether it's a good or service, where people are going to part with their money to buy it from you? And in a lot of cases, this isn't clear. We hear stuff from clients where, oh my gosh, I got this thing and I can sell it in all these markets. And I've been in sales and marketing a long time. And when I hear stuff like that, I'm like, oh my God, that's a lot of work, and it's a mile wide and inch deep. And we don't want that. We want the idea. We want the customer deliverable to be pretty narrow, but hugely deep. You know who the customers are, you know your target customers, your target markets, you know who you're competing against. So that's a big thing for me, is I really want to know what your competitive advantage is. And if you don't have one, that tends to pull you down into being a low price bidder for jobs and things like that, which nobody really wants to classify or categorize their businesses at that. So that's one item. One of the other items is we really want people understanding cash flow and how it works. And Andrew, I know you did a paper, talked about best practices with a lender. And one of the things that's on there is put together a 13-week cash flow budget. And I hope you're going to talk about that, because that's really important. But
Yeah.
You would be appalled at the number of clients that we talk to where, oh my God, you've got 90 days of accounts receivable, and it's always that long. Who follows up on that? And then you dig in a little more and you find out, well, nobody really follows up on that. That's why it's 90 days when it should be 30. And that's the same sort of business that's paying people in 15 days. So now you've got this big squeeze on cash. The business owner is having to basically float the business, and the big wildly different swings in accounts payable versus accounts receivable. And then inventory is a whole nother area. So cash flow is really important. One of the things that we advised people early in the COVID days was, okay, first, talk to your landlord, talk to your bank, talk to your people, skinny stuff down to the essential stuff as much as you possibly can, and then put together a budget. What do you really need? Because what you saw happening was, boom, here's all these government programs like EIDL and PPP, and there's a mad rush for people to go apply for it, but they don't even really know how much money they need. They don't know what they need it for because they don't have a budget. So that cash flow budget was really important, and it's simply when is cash coming in and when cash is going out. We see a lot of clients, if they're renting a building, that are in a space that's simply too big for the business, because here in Northern Colorado, like a lot of the Front Range, space is kind of at a premium. So boom, something opens up, there's a lot of pressure to grab it. And then suddenly somebody's in a 3,500 square foot space when the business should really be using a 2,000 square foot space. And then they spend the next 3 years basically making the rent payment. So items like that are the sorts of things that we're looking at to say, what are you looking at to right size the business? And you have to be very realistic about your sales levels. I mean, if you've seen revenues drop off 50% over the last 6 months, it's awfully tough to suddenly say that, oh yeah, in 60 days, I'm going to be back up to 100%. Well, what's going to drive that? What industry macro trends are happening that way? So that's something where some realism really is helpful. So I think that's my general answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think probably the thing I hear most with clients these days is right sizing in one shape or form or another, is getting the business leaned down to reflect a new reality on the revenue front. And that involves a pretty comprehensive review. And as you mentioned, a 13-week cash flow is a great tool to start, is kind of the go-to tool. With that, I want to ask you one last thing, Mike. Is there any particular program that you're putting together now or have in place that business owners may find helpful if they can contact you guys and look for some resources or information?
Yeah, I think I'll mention about 3 or 4 things there, Andrew. Good question. I think anytime, as Glenn mentioned and David mentioned, that you can get an unbiased set of eyes off of what you're doing, challenge some of your assumptions, challenge some of your projections, that's helpful. And it gives you a grounding, in essence, to what you're looking at doing. When I used to apply for loans for a couple of companies that I was looking at considering buying, it was helpful to have a banker look at that along with you, because they had a wide scope of businesses that they were looking at, and it was helpful. So anyway, back to your original question. The SBDC is a really helpful resource all throughout Colorado. SCORE, the Service Corps Retired Executives, does similar work. That's also partially funded by the SBA, as the SBDC is. That's a helpful resource. And then you've got around the state of Colorado some industry-specific resources. Maybe it's a tech incubator, maybe it's a restaurant and food focused organization that can help you. So any time that you can get a consultant to look at that, it's helpful. I also encourage people to look at what's going on in their town or their municipality in the economic development or economic health area. I work with 5 towns or cities in my county, and every one of them has had a support program, whether it's a loan or grant for small businesses to apply for. Even a town as small as 8,000 people, they're getting CARES money and they're putting out programs to support their small businesses. So be engaged and look at what's going on with your own municipality. Talk to your current bank. Just find out what's going on with them. What are they doing for assistance? And Andrew, you'll talk more about that, I know. And then the last thing that I will mention is on a macro sense, be aware of the CARES Act programs, PPP, the payroll protection program, which came out through the banking system. People generally heard about from their banks, but it was also pretty well publicized. The economic injury loans, I'm pretty sure there'll be another 3rd round of that comes out probably in the 1st quarter. So that will be publicized by our organization, Chambers of Commerce, TMA, other organizations. So you do have to keep your ear to the ground, but those are some pretty useful resources that I would encourage any business owner to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely great advice. I want to give a big commercial for the SBDCs all over Colorado, and in fact, all over the country. I work with the SBDCs in multiple states, and I can tell you they're wonderful people, a lot of talented, experienced people at SBDCs all over the place that are doing great work and provide not only resources themselves, but access to other resources and expertise. And so you guys are doing great work, and thank you for that. And
thank
keep
you.
it up. And we'll provide, again, we're going to provide this information for everybody so they can access it. I want to turn to Dave. Dave, there's probably no better panelist today to talk about the particular challenges and how to start navigating out of them than you in your work with C Squared. I've known you for some time in your firm, and I know that your reputation. And so I'd like to talk a little bit today about what your experience has been like with clients who are struggling with cash flow, maybe struggling with making loan payments, trying to figure out how to right size their business and get on to better days. If you could start by talking a little bit about how you guys approach that, I think that would be very helpful for everybody.
Well, what we find, Andrew, and Mike has already mentioned some of the things, what we find with many of the people is that they have not done any forecasting. They have not done that forward planning and that cash forecasting that Andrew and Mike are talking about. And so they don't know where they really are. They know that they've got a problem. They're not sure what next steps should be. And, panic mode sets in. And quite often when people finally come to us or they've been introduced to us by their banker or someone, they are in full panic mode. So what I like to do is put it in a vernacular that many people can understand. And that is, I'm a former Air Force fighter pilot. And one of the things that we were trained in was that when things get sticky, your order of priority of what you need to do in next steps are aviate, navigate, communicate. How that applies to a business is suddenly things are going wrong, the cash flow isn't working, so you need to aviate. You need to be able to keep flying the business. So you need to know where you are. So you need to look at that cash position. You need to be able to think about what you can do to save cash. That's where the navigation comes in. When you navigate, that's the forecasting. That's your cash forecasting. And then you can say, okay, where am I going to be next week? Where am I going to be in the week after that? And look at that and see, where can I look from my suppliers, my landlord, and others where I might get some help? Where can I go to my clients? Where am I going to get my money from them? who might be in a position to pay a little bit early to help me out, from that standpoint. So there's your navigation. Communicate. That's when you start talking to people and finding out what is possible. That's when you're talking with your landlord and saying, can I delay some rent? When you're talking with key vendors, instead of 30 days, can I go to 60 days? And communicate the truth. The truth will help you. And as I told one CEO of a manufacturing company who had a key supplier who was beating on his desk, and I said, look him straight in the eye and tell him, you cannot intimidate me. My attention span is too short. When he stands there and his mouth drops open, then with that lull say, now let me explain to you what's going on and how we're going to fix this. And that will usually calm them down enough that you can actually tell your story. Now, speaking of stories, let me tell you about a client that we have. And it's a medical services provider. And they provide hearing, dental, and eye care to people in nursing homes and assisted living. Well, you all know what happened with the pandemic. Everything got locked down. You could not get into any of those facilities. 114 facilities suddenly locked them down. They couldn't get into. Well, very quickly, their revenue went to zero. And here you had all these people on payroll, and what are you going to do with them? Because they had been doing a 90-day rolling forecast, they had done also a lesser detailed 6-month forecast, and they had built some reserves. They were able to figure out what their next steps were. So they went to their landlord and said, here's where we're at. We need some help. The landlord said, okay, let's defer your rent for the next 6 months, tack it onto the back of your lease, but you're going to have to pay interest on it. That agreement took all of 30 minutes because they could show their landlord that, hey, cash just stopped coming in. We do have some reserves, but it's very important that we try to keep our people and our licenses active. Then they went to their employees and said, with our cash, here's where we can go. If the lockdown goes for 6 months, we're going to put everybody on 50% of your salary. Then after 6 months, if things start to pick up and we can get 1/3 of the facilities open, we can boost you to 75% of your salary. And once we hit 50% of the facilities back open, we can take you to 100% of your salary. And so what's happened with it is things started to open for them in July. And they were able to keep their word with their employees and being able to boost them to 60% a little bit early. Now they're currently having more facilities open, but on the verge of closing. But they've taken their employees to 75%. They did get PPP money, which was factored into their forecast and their staying power. And so using that, it allowed them to be able to have a plan for the employees because they are a company where everything is all about people. They service people with health issues. They are people who are professionally trained, and without people, they cannot service their clients. And so that's just an example of how some forward planning allowed them to, as I say, roll with the punches. And they will survive and they will keep the majority of their employees, although the employees have been suffering. Dental assistants, hygienists, audiologists, assistants, people like that, they're not the most highly paid people in the world and they have families. And so they've been struggling through all of that. And, but that's just an example of how you aviate, navigate, and communicate.
It's great advice. So thoughtful the way you described it. Of all those things, if there's someone out there today saying, well, I'm in that same situation, but I don't have maybe a lot of access to resources. I don't have a big company and multiple people to think about. It's really sort of a small family business. What would be the best piece of advice you would give to them about how to prioritize what to do first if they're staring down, a situation where they can't make their loan payment and they're going to have to work with their creditors? What advice would you give to that person?
The first thing is you have to know where you are. You have to know on the near term, and make it 30 days look at and say, okay, where is the cash going to come from? Where is it committed to go? And where can I renegotiate some of those commitments? And be able to look at that, and maybe it's members of the team saying, hey, we got to agree to a 40% pay cut. We're in survival mode, the company and you, so this is what we need to do. Be able to put that together, and then once you have some of those facts and figures, then go to your banker and tell them, this is where we are, this is what's happening, well, this is what we're putting in place. Now, your banker, because they see a lot what's going on, and they're very busy, and I happen to know one banker that had 14 restaurants in his loan portfolio, and 9 of them would return his phone calls. I tell you right now, a lender takes that as bad news when he doesn't get return phone calls, and trying to reach those. He did hear from 4 right away, and they said, this is our plan. This is what we're going to do. And he said, well, how do you know when you're shut down? How do you know when you're going to open up again? And his comment, one restaurateur's comment was, hey, it's going to be tough. We donated all the food to the food bank before it spoiled. We've got an empty house here, but I've talked to my suppliers, and they said, if you can open back up, we'll give you 30 days of credit. We'll help you out. So he'd already done some of that. And that's the key thing, is when you're talking to a lender, be able to show them that you're planning, that you've got some action steps you put in place. And they're going to be pretty rudimentary. They're going to be pretty simple of, how do I get a buck in the door, and how do I save 50 cents going out the door? Yeah. And try to see, what you can do about that. And, when you tell somebody, look them straight in the eye and tell somebody, I don't have a dime, but in 12 days, these clients are going to pay, and I'm going to have a nickel. I can give you a share of the nickel, and I can promise it on this date. And then make sure when you make that promise, you can keep it. Because if you can shortchange somebody based on a promise that you're keeping, and they'll continue to work with you. If you don't keep your word, that's when people start suing you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would concur wholeheartedly with everything you said there. As an alternative bank lender, non-bank lender now, and as a former commercial banker, right on the money with that advice, communication, openness, and a willingness to work with all your creditors and or partners is absolutely paramount. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit deeper a little later. I want to turn to David Silverman. David, you have owned your own firm. You have been practicing law for a long time. You've worked with banks and finance companies all over the country. I'd like to get your perspective from the legal side. If you are if someone out there in our audience is an entrepreneur who is not only staring down the face of having to work with their creditors, but looking at the legal ramifications of that, in addition to the financial ramifications, and they are intertwined. But tell us a little bit about some of the things that our audience today can think about from a legal perspective, to get in front of things, to try to manage this process and this recovery, and not get in a situation where some of the options aren't available anymore. What kind of legal advice would you give to our entrepreneurs today?
Thanks, Andrew. First of all, I have to give you all a caveat. I'm not giving out any legal advice today. That I can't do. My rules of professional conduct prohibit that. We don't have an attorney-client relationship, and I apologize for having to give this caveat, but I do need to do that. Okay, now, having said that, the advice that you've been given so far is all preparatory to and will avoid all the legal actions that you want, that a guy like me is going to tell you to be sure to avoid. And those are all the ways to avoid them. Now, to go back to Dave Johnson's aviate, navigate, and communicate, part of your aviation portion of this is to pull out your documents, you've got to read every contract that you have. And that includes your and break this up into a couple of different pieces. There's inside your company, there's outside your company. And then a third piece is really you personally. And here are the examples. Inside your company, when you're talking about reducing staff, you've got to make sure you got to take a look at your employment agreements, your employee handbooks, your job descriptions, your different levels of employees, your managers and your supervisorial staff, your hourly workers, and you have to be certain to navigate those in each of their appropriate ways. Don't guess, and for goodness sake, don't go by memory, because in the midst of what we're in now, which is the same as in the midst of any crisis like this, regardless of the cause, okay, you've got a lot on your plate and you cannot rely on your memory. Go back to your documents, take a look at them, read them carefully, and see exactly where you are allowed to navigate through those documents. Go to your bookkeeper and your accountant. I can tell you that my experience as a business owner since 1983 and counseling clients since 1983, if I were to wager a guess, I would say that 90% of small business owners' accounting is not right. And it's not right because your bookkeeper is lousy or your bookkeeper, or whatever the reason is. So it's really critical to take a good long look at that right away. Check with your partners. If you have partners in whatever form that may be, whether you're a shareholder agreement, an operating agreement, a partnership agreement, check your governing documents, because listen, the law is all about relationships, okay? And those relationships are governed either by documents that you sign or by statutes and common law that governs all of our relationships, or a combination of all of those things. So take a look at your governing documents with respect to your organization. If you have partners, see what your shareholder agreement / bylaws / operating agreement, partnership agreement calls for in terms of decision-making processes, because in these circumstances, you and your partners may very well disagree. And the one thing you want to be certain to do is to eliminate that disagreement and make sure you are all on the right page. One of the things that I'm finding now is that, boy, I'll tell you, the number of partnership disputes, regardless of the form of the organization, are going up. And there's a reason for that. People just cannot agree on how to navigate their way through this kind of this deep of a crisis. Okay, that's inside. Oh yeah, one last piece: private investors. That's a little bit different than your bankers. Okay, so if you've got a minority shareholder, a minority unit holder in an LLC, a limited partner, it's a little bit different with a limited partner because they may not have as much say as a member in an operating agreement, but nevertheless, consider that part of your internal investigation, what's on the inside. Highly related to inside is you personally, okay? What do you have? What are your legal guarantees? Did you guarantee any loans, personal guarantee any loans? That's going to be important. If you did, that's a conversation that now flows into your household. Okay, if you didn't, hey, you might just want to skip the whole thing and say, okay, I'm done. And walking away is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it may very well be a good thing. And if there are no personal legal ramifications for you, and I'm putting aside employees, et cetera, for the moment, for this part of the discussion, that may very well be the best thing for you. And it may actually be the best thing for your employees. Maybe it's better that they simply get laid off, get unemployment, and have an opportunity to move on. That is part of the internal investigation. And again, the legal aspect of that is make sure that you review your agreements and that you have either at-will agreements, or if you've got for-cause agreements that that limits your ability to, or the reasons why you can lay people off or fire them, terminate them, that you do that within that context. Okay, now outside of your organization, you've got vendor agreements, vendor supplier agreements, you've got customer agreements. Yes, you've got the bank, obviously, you've got creditors, and you have credit cards and customer obligations. Okay, now I've separated creditors from credit cards. Credit card debt is something entirely different than your creditor / meaning vendor and supplier debt creditors. Okay, those are people that you have mutual you've got mutual interest in. They more than likely want you to stay in business as much or even more perhaps as you want to stay in business. Review that documentation, see what your obligations are, see what their obligations are, and then when you've aviated that portion of that, then you can start to navigate through it through effective communication. And when you communicate with them, just open up a conversation. Don't call people up and say, I'm not paying you. That would have a negative legal repercussion for you, not to mention your business. Okay, what you want to do is simply open up a conversation and see what the mutual need is. Because as I said, they probably want you just as much as you want them. And these other gentlemen have given you some great advice about how to navigate and communicate with those people. Most people don't want to be in a lawsuit, including you and including me. You know, nobody wants to be in a lawsuit. It's a no-win situation. So threatening those kinds of things really doesn't do anybody any good. All right, now let's talk about the real key one here, and that's the bank and the receipt of a notice of default. Oh, one more thing I do want to say. I want to make sure we get in here. When you start looking at your obligations and things that you need to pay, please be absolutely 100% certain to put at the very top of the payment list payroll taxes. Don't miss them. Just don't. Just don't. There isn't even a conversation around this, because you will get stuck with that personal liability, and I'm telling you, there's no way out of it. Okay, well, not no way, but there is that much of a possibility, and only under extraordinary circumstances. So don't listen to anybody that says, don't worry about the payroll taxes. They go away. They don't. Okay. And, it's going to be a big deal coming out in the next several years when all this comes, when the federal government starts looking at that. So don't do that. Okay. Now your bank, you've got to have a really good understanding of your lending documents, the terms and conditions in there before you make that call to your banker. And the call that you make to your banker, the content of that call is going to be very dependent upon the relationship that you have with your banker. If you don't already have a good relationship, now you're going to learn why it's so important to have that good relationship. You heard Andrew talk about 9 bankers, and they didn't, the banker that didn't hear from 9 customers. Well, of course, that's horrible. They probably didn't have a good relationship with them to begin with, and that just exacerbated it. When you get that notice of default, probably were scared, just like Glenn was, just like I was when I got mine. But you know what? You learn that if you understand what your banking documents say, that notice of default is truly just the beginning of the journey. Okay. And if you understand what's in there, including what your time limitations are, what notice requirements there are, what the consequences are, if you've got a personal guarantee attached to it, when and where and how does that fit into the program, you've got to come to that conversation with knowledge. That is especially important with your banker. Okay. If you're unable to work out a situation with your banker, or one of the ways to work it out, you'll go to an alternative finance company. Okay, someone like Andrew or the myriad of other ones that are out there. There's, like the rest of us in business, there's good ones, bad ones, and you're going to have to be really careful with that. And the way to be careful with that, to avoid to avoid a disastrous agreement either with your banker or an unfortunate agreement with your banker or with a subsequent alternative finance company is the knowledge that you're going to gain from right now going through the process of reading those documents. Yeah, there's a lot of legalese to it. No doubt about it. Don't get caught up in that legalese. There's some really basic stuff in there that's really easy to understand. You know, your borrowing base, when you break it down and you take out all the extraneous language, is really pretty simple to understand. When you're in default, if you take out all the wherefores, whereases, and heretofores, it's really pretty easy to understand. Yes, call your attorney if you need to, and it's absolutely worth a few dollars to do that. And I have found in my profession that there are more than enough lawyers out there that have been kind enough to give out free advice and free consultations, given the fact that we are all suffering from this together. Okay, so that would be, those would be my primary things that you need to do from a legal perspective. And also, I will tell you from my own personal experience of being through, crises, both shallow and extraordinarily deep. And the crisis that I went through was during the 2008 recession. So it was the recession compounded, an already bad situation. If you're diligent enough and sincere enough, and so far the best advice I've heard is whoever said, tell the truth. Don't stray from that. Just don't. Okay. It is invaluable. It in so many ways I shouldn't even have to explain. And you'll find there are some people out there that will really help you. They may be your banker. In my case, I had a banker, a vendor, and a client, my three angels, that I could not have recovered without. And it was in part because I called them all up and said, this is what happened. Now you don't have to do that. You can say, everybody knows what happened. This is what's happened to me. And this is my plan. And this is how I'm going to help you through it. This is how we're going to all come through this together. And from that, you will be able to navigate through your documents. And if you make any changes in your governing documents, be absolutely certain to document them. Okay, that's the last piece of advice I'm going to give you. Whatever changes you make during a crisis, and this includes all of your email correspondences back and forth, okay, make sure that it is finalized in some sort of written agreement that says we've agreed to change our documents this way, and that way. Because when everybody comes out of this, sometime next year, there's going to be a lot of disagreements about, well, you said I didn't have to pay until then. Well, I don't have anything in writing. And if it's not in writing, we got a real problem. Okay, I think that's what I've got. Andrew?
Great. All great advice. In particular, I like that you pointed out about paying payroll taxes and not getting in trouble with not only your creditors, but with your biggest creditor and your meanest and toughest creditor, the IRS. So that would be certainly priority number one, I think, in my experience. And I don't know, Dave, do you want to comment on that? Dave Johnson, do you want to say anything about that? I know you guys have seen some situations with the IRS, and maybe if you got a brief comment on it, and then we'll move on from there.
Well, what's happened is we got a couple of situations where we had gone in and they were really upside down, and they didn't even know they had not paid their payroll taxes. And once that was uncovered, we said, go to your attorney immediately, look at the possibility of filing a bankruptcy, and then get your story together and approach IRS and let them know what happened. Because you can buy a lot of time to work things out if you are out there communicating.
Yeah, no question about it. I think getting in front of that with the IRS is always a priority. Certainly, I have seen it in my business. I have lent into several situations where the IRS actually had a lien in place, and we had to negotiate with the IRS to try to get subordination agreement from them so the business could survive. Otherwise, the IRS was not going to get any payment. So I think the message is they can be negotiated with. They're not easy to deal with. I'm not necessarily saying that, but depending on the revenue officer that you deal with, they do understand these situations, and their job is to try to mitigate their own losses. So they are willing in a lot of cases to work with you to the best of their ability to keep things moving. So,
hey, Andrew, I will, while you're talking, I'm going to ask you to step out of your facilitator role for a moment. So we've talked about bankers and banking relationships. I think every person on the panel talked about this. You've been a commercial banker. You're also in alternate financing now, but what priorities and other priorities beyond the one that you just listed would you advise to clients when they're dealing with a banking relationship through times like this?
Sure. I'm going to echo a lot of what our panelists already said, and hopefully I can summarize it in an intelligent way. I was a commercial banker in the Great Recession, 08, 09, 2010, 2011. I still think about the conversations I had. You never forget those conversations. I'm sure Glenn never forgot some of the conversations that he had, and dealing with just impossible situations. And then now bringing it forward to today after 8 years as an alternative non-bank lender who deals with non-bank credit, tougher situations, whether they be distress or high growth, because they both have to be funded. They sound like one would be a lot better, but frankly, they're both tough. It's one thing to be in a difficult situation where your business is dropping revenue and can't pay its bills. It's another situation to be in a position where you've got a huge revenue ramp potentially in front of you and you cannot fund it, because neither one is going to happen if you can't fund it. So having said that, I would say that a couple things you want to do. I put out a white paper, I know, amongst this panel discussing this topic, and I'm happy to make that available to everybody. But I'm going to echo a lot of what you guys already said, and that is, first thing is be proactive. You absolutely have to get out in front of things. I know it's painful. I know it's tough. It's tough on the other side as a lender. It's not fun for anybody. But your problems become your banker's problems or your creditor's problems. So reach out to them. And when you do that, second thing, go to them in an open manner. Be honest about the real challenge and the multiple challenges you may face. Hiding it from them is only going to delay the inevitable, and it's not going to lead to a very constructive conversation, because if they don't know what's truly going on, they're really not going to be able to help you. And as part of that, if they don't trust you, if you believe me, I've been in this position as a lender. If you feel like your client's not telling you the truth, you're sure as hell not going to go above your head and try to put your head on the chopping block to advocate for that client, because it's going to ruin your own credibility internally, right? So be honest, be open. And then third, go in with a plan. Just like Dave said, just like Glenn mentioned, and even David Silverman said it, go, take stock of what reality is. Try to put together a cash flow model if you can. If you cannot do that, or you don't have the resources yourself, reach out to our panel, reach out to the SBDC, reach out to somebody who can facilitate that for you. There's actually a lot of free models online that you can access. Some are better than others, but put together some kind of a cash flow model where you can look in the next 13-week situation and present that to your creditor. When you make that meeting, have that information available, and then use that 13-week cash flow to actually create, as Dave Johnson mentioned, prioritize your actions from that point. When you go to a bank or you go to a creditor with that information, it builds so much goodwill with them to show that you've actually thought this through, that you have a plan, that you want to make your payments and you want to get on the right side of this. That goodwill goes a long way. And then I would say this from the other side of the table, when a lender knows that you're making that good faith effort, right? Believe me, to be a commercial banker or even an alternative lender like mine, you have to be a client cheerleader, right? I mean, you really do. Believe me, banks don't make any money if they don't lend you money. And your problem again becomes their problem. So they want to help. They want to advocate for you. They want to try to make that situation better for everybody because they're losing sleep over it also. They have meetings, they have mandates, they have reports that they have to fill out. And if they've got a problem, it's just as big a problem on their side for them. So I lost a lot of sleep as a banker trying to advocate and help clients, believe me. So it works both ways. And then I would say, once you've done that and you've gone to your bank, make sure that they know that you have also put in place internal plans. And sometimes those plans can be difficult. Dave mentioned them. Sometimes, owners, maybe staff members are taking a little bit of a haircut in on a paycheck, or you're delaying this, or you're not doing that. Showing them in good faith that you're executing on that plan and you're trying to preserve cash flow, you're trying to make payments. And then the last thing I would say is, as you work through that with them, the one thing to keep in mind is think about when you go in to meet with them. These negotiations are give and take, right? So it doesn't mean the bank doesn't want to negotiate just because you've got a notice of default. Hopefully you can get in front of it before you ever get there. But if you do, as David mentioned, it's just the start. That's a legal issue on their side. It's a loan policy issue on their side. They have to follow their policies, and it is the start, beginning of a negotiation, not the end. And so when you go in, have the plan, be ready to make some concessions. And in return for that, what I think you will find is that your bank is probably going to, assuming they think that your business can turn it around and then they want to give you some time to make sure that you can survive, they're going to ask for some concessions. Those concessions might include maybe trading off a little higher rate for a little longer term, or going to an interest-only payment for a short period of time, not amortizing payments until you can get through this situation. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 9 or a year, whatever it is. And they might be asking you, particularly if you personally guaranteed that situation, they might be asking you to present another piece of collateral. Maybe you have another asset. Maybe you have something else you can bring to the table. And they might say, we would like to take a security interest in that collateral if we could. And if you can do that, we would be willing to do this. So it's a give and take. Hopefully those situations come out win-win. I think in most cases, if people go in good faith, that they do come out win-win situations. I know I was involved in a lot of them in the Great Recession, and they worked out. And then the last point I want to make, and then we can get to some questions, is if a bank situation does not work out, one of the things that a bank might do is they might suggest calling an alternative lender, someone like myself. And guys like myself who work in non-bank credit situations, we almost all have very deep relationships with all banks, because that is generally where our phone rings, and that's who calls and says, hey, I've got a client that we're just not going to be able to work this situation out. We'd like to get whole. The client continues to need funding. Is there something you guys can do? And there is a big alternative universe out there. Alternative non-bank is always going where the risk is higher, is always going to result in it costing a little more. But if it is a bridge to a better day, if it is a bridge to survival, if it is a bridge to actually not only turning around, but actually growing your business, and alternative lenders in many cases are actually set up for growth and work as well or better in growth as they do in distress, then it is worth having that conversation if it gets you to the other side. So something to keep in mind. If the bank is not working with you, it doesn't mean it's the end. It means that maybe it's time to look at some alternatives and consider that option as a means to get to the other side. And I say that both from the perspective of high growth, and I say that from a perspective of distress. I have seen some businesses here in the last 8-9 months. They're actually busier than ever. This pandemic, for whatever reason, has caused their business to go through the roof. So there's a growth problem out there too. It's not just distress. So if you're in that situation, think about those things also.
Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to thank you as well as David, Dave, Glenn. Great information from our panelists, great real world experience. We wanted to leave time here for questions from some of our attendees. So I will throw it open. Feel free to either speak up, unmute yourself if you have a question, or put your question in chat, and Becky will help me moderate this. So does anyone have any questions who has listened to our panelists? Okay.
If I may, the only thing that I would like is any advice on maybe the forgiveness on the Paycheck Protection Program, anything that you guys are hearing regarding any new rounds of funding, any other grants or anything else that's possibly coming down the pipeline.
Thanks, Danny. If I may, I'll take an initial stab at the PPP forgiveness portion. There has been some guidance that has come out from the SBA on that, because the banks that actually loaned you the money were waiting to get that guidance from the SBA. We have a couple of consultants of ours who work for banks, and it's pretty important you keep in touch with your bank that's loaning you the money, because it's up in the air and very much a case-by-case question whether your bank, for example, is going to use the SBA forms, or whether your bank is going to create their own forms as far as calculating the forgiveness. We did get a couple of favorable rulings that came out over the last 30 to 60 days, such as if your loan is $50,000 or less, you have had a couple of the forgiveness requirements lifted. They're just automatically going to assume you're at 100%. So that has helped many of the smaller business lenders who got those loans. So that will be helpful. But I would encourage you to keep in touch with your bank, and I would encourage you to make an appointment with the SBDC just to make sure you're getting the current info on that. But the guidance will actually come from your bank, because that's who you got the loan from. And I would encourage you to keep in touch primarily with your bank contact there. And Glenn, anyone else, I welcome you chiming in on that.
Yes, talk to your accountant CPA. There is a provision for being able to take your current losses and apply them back, I think 2 years to 2019, 2018 returns. I'm not a tax attorney. I don't play one on TV, so I don't really know. I do know only that I have a client that has netted several hundred thousands of dollars by being able to do that. So that was part of the CARES Act. It's buried somewhere. Your accountant or CPA should know.
Okay. And Danny, I'm sorry, you had a second part to your question. Could you refresh my memory what that was?
Basically just, anything coming down the pipeline for any new funding rounds or grants, PPP. I've been waiting myself on the forgiveness just because I didn't know if they were going to change some guidance, or if they were going to have another round that maybe matched the first one, and then it would all be roped into the same type of application.
My suspicion is that there will be another CARES Act round probably in the first quarter. I mean, we'll have new legislator, we'll have new different executive branch. So that's negotiations probably going to come out of that. And Glenn, within OEDIT, don't we also have, I think, a loan program coming out of the state of Colorado in the first quarter?
Yeah, determination of that. There's different rounds of the Energize Colorado Gap Fund. Whether those will go into a third round or not, they're funding second round right now. I share the same sentiment as Mike. I think that delaying the compliance to the PPP loan is probably a wise thing to do, because it could change. I think you're going to look at another stimulus plan at the first quarter of next year, and whether that interacts with PPP or that's in the spirit of like the Bennett Young proposal that's on the table. The details to that are on Senator Bennett's website. It could be something like that, but yeah, that's evolving at this particular point.
And also, Governor Polis is putting together plans for a special session with current legislators that will involve current legislators, not the ones that were elected to serve as in the new legislation. I know that there's been a great deal of concern on our local Capitol Hill that the lack of a new CARES Act, new round of funding from the federal government is really putting is hurting our own opportunities to simply supplement that, because there isn't anything to supplement. So I would keep an eye on what our legislature may very well do in the next, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, 30 days.
Thank you, David.
And one more thing in that regard too, from a legal perspective, the one thing I forgot to mention, keep a close eye on executive orders. Okay, keep a close eye on those because those change frequently. So you want to be in compliance with those.
Thank you, David. Other questions? Danny, thanks for that question.
Thank you.
I did want to mention one thing too. I heard more than one person on the panel had said how important it is to keep in touch with your banker and keep the communication going. And I know when I had my business, I just made it a point to have coffee with my banker like every 4 months, every 3 months, just to have a dialogue. They'd know what was going on with my business. I would know what was going on in their world, what the resources were, and it just led to that relationship building. So that was pretty important.
Mike, I'd add on to that. One of the key things that maybe didn't get talked about a lot is vendors, right? So I think Dave mentioned it, but vendors are often creditors also, right? So if you're on trade terms, net 30, net 60, net 90, reach out to those vendors the same way you would your bank or your creditor, and say, listen, things are tough. I want to work through this with you. I know this is important for both of us. What can we do to work together? Whether that be partial payments, whatever it may be, some delayed payments, whatever it is, it goes a long way with your vendors, just knowing that you're on the same side of the table with them and that you're doing everything you can and that you're not walking away from your obligations and that you have every intention to pay. And, oftentimes what happens is when you do that, if you can keep that goodwill going, your trade credit won't be shut off. The terms might change a little bit. There might be more cash involved up front, whatever it may be, but you may not be completely cut off. And I've seen that happen. And in some industries with key vendors, that can be very, very devastating for that to happen. So vendors are just as important. They are creditors oftentimes. Get in front of them with the same plan. And I think it'll do a lot to help through this crisis.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions from any of our attendees, just to make sure we don't leave anything unaddressed? Okay. Any final quick thoughts from any of our panelists? Anything we didn't cover? And I do want to say a big thanks to the Turnaround Management Association. You folks have some unbelievably specialized skills at a time when they're going to be needed by business people. So your talents here and your willingness to share that is really appreciated, certainly on behalf of my SBDC Center, and I'm sure that Glenn feels the same way statewide. So we really applaud what you're doing, and thanks for sharing this expertise. Any final thoughts for our panelists, from our panelists?
Yeah, Mike, I'll just echo that. Thanks to TMA and everybody that's involved in this panel. And then the one thing I did want to just say in closing is really when you look at that concept of cash flow, and then you look at global cash flow as a business owner where we're bringing together cash flow from your personal life. Now, when you're in this situation, you've got a cash flow chain. You've got suppliers and banks and everybody else and a landlord that cash flow has got to make sense. And you might getting pressure from somebody that you're not sure why you're getting that pressure as much from a landlord as maybe a supplier is not. Well, that cash flow has all got to fit together. And it's just super important for us in this particular thing is just to work together, right? Just be proactive, work together, have a plan. And I can't say that enough. We're going to come out of this, and, we've seen what happens when we come out of it a little bit. Things get really good really fast, but we want to make sure you're there so that when we come out of this, that we can still have you as a business in the state. And just work together, stay safe, and, thanks for everything you do.
Yeah, to add that, and again, this is from my seat as a business owner for a long time. It reminds me of that old story. Guy gets stuck in a hole. Doctor walks by, drops down a prescription, walks on. Guy looks up, and what does he see? A priest walks by, drops a prayer down to him, and walks on. Next thing he knows, a friend of his comes by and drops into the hole with him. Guy looks at him and says, "What are you, stupid or something?" His friend says, "No, I've been here before. I know the way out." Okay. There are a lot of people out there who know how to get out of this. Maybe not one person knows everything for sure, but there's a lot of people. So reach out to your friends, reach out to your competition, reach out to whatever resources that you can find. There are people, everybody's in this situation, and everybody can help you contribute. And have hope. I always hear hope is not a strategy. I don't believe that. Hope is a great strategy. Not the only one, but keep the faith, because we will come out of this, and you can do this.
Thank you, David. Dave, Andrew, any final comments?
I just want to say quickly on behalf of TMA, thank you to all of you, Mike and Glenn and Becky, for putting all this together. And you guys have been wonderful partners. Odit and everybody, you guys have brought so much goodwill and resource to the table to complement what we do. And, everybody has said it, but we are in this together and we will get out of it together. So use your resources, reach out to anybody on this panel. And if you need to refer someone in, I know that this group of people is here to help. So good luck to everyone. And we look forward to getting back to you. I know this is not the last webinar that we're going to put together. We're going to do a series, I believe. If we didn't fail the test today, maybe we'll get invited back. So we look forward to the next topic, and hopefully we'll be able to add some more value. And thank you all again for putting this together.
Thanks, Andrew. And Becky, could I ask you to put up that slide that gives the contact information for, in case anyone on the call wants to talk to someone later within TMA or the SBDC? There's our contact info. So, and then with that, I think we will let everybody go. Thanks again for your participation, and we will end this call. And best wishes to you, and feel free to reach out. You're not alone. Thank you.